Hello again. Well, the Prime Minister has promised to return to Brussels with some new ideas to try and solve the Irish backstop issue. And writing in the Sunday Telegraph, Theresa May once again assures readers that the UK will leave the EU on time, but with only 8 weeks to go. There is quite a lot to do. So yesterday, I sat down with the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, and I started by asking him what the government's next steps are.
Well, we'll continue to talk to our European partners to see if we can get an agreement and get an agreement as quickly as possible. Time is moving on, and there's also increasing worry about the European economy and the state of the global economy. We've seen a big slowdown in China that's had a knock-on effect. We've seen Italy now go into recession. We've seen the German economy slow down, the French economy slow down. Really, we do need to avoid any disruption to that European trading system.
You say that you're going to try and talk more to the EU, but at the same time, Theresa May is saying that she wants to get some changes to that withdrawal agreement. But if you look at what EU politicians and leaders are saying, it simply doesn't chime with that at all. Donald Tusk says the withdrawal agreement not open for renegotiation. The Irish government says the same. Macron says the deal is not renegotiable. Juncker says it's the best and only possible deal. Is the government deluded?
Well, are they really saying that they would rather not negotiate and end up in a no-deal position? I think that's not a responsible approach to take. It would have an impact on the European economy, on jobs and prosperity. And for those leaders...
And on the British economy.
And for the British economy, absolutely. And so it's in all our interests to get to that agreement. For the EU to say, we're not going to even discuss it, seems to me quite irresponsible. So
from the conversations that you're having, do you think some EU countries are more open than others to negotiate?
I think there's, as there always has been, a difference between the member states and the European Commission. I think the European Commission has a priority for the political ideology of Europe about ever closer union and the four freedoms. The member states, who have governments who need to be re-elected, have to worry about real jobs, real prosperity and real trade.
Well, let's talk about the backstop, because, I mean, that was Parliament's message, wasn't it, that they'd accept the deal if the backstop was effectively got rid of. But that's just not going to happen, is it? I mean, I was speaking to the Irish Europe Minister last weekend. She was absolutely clear that this is not something that Ireland can possibly negotiate on.
Well, if they won't negotiate on it, then they are likely to end up with no deal. And the European Union said that's the best route to get a hard border. So for the Irish, I think it's even more important than most that they are willing to talk to us about what the alternative ways are of achieving no hard border, because that's the stated position of both the Irish government, the British government, and indeed the European Union.
One of the things that may be a price for changes to the backstop is the customs union. It's something that apparently Jean-Claude Juncker has floated. It's certainly something that Labour are pushing for. Is a customs union something that you could stomach to get a deal over the line?
No.
Would you resign?
Well, I think it would not fulfil the promise we made to leave the European Union. We would not be taking back control of our trade policy. You cannot have an independent trade policy if you're in a customs union. Turkey finds itself in that position at the moment. It can't even talk to the United Kingdom about what might happen afterwards because it's locked in a partial customs union with the EU.
So would you resign if that were to become
government policy? I don't think so. I don't think it's about us. I mean, that makes it about the politicians, not about the policy. And I think we should concentrate on the policy, and I think that would be a bad policy for the United Kingdom.
The other thing I'm very keen to ask you about is an extension to Article 50, because this is something that's increasingly been talked about, because, frankly, there's still so much stuff to get done if there's going to be any chance of leaving the EU on the day that the government wants to happen. Now, when we spoke in June, you said this about an extension of Article 50. I wouldn't find that politically acceptable and I couldn't support it. Is that your position still?
Well, that was in the context of us not having reached an agreement and simply extending the time. I don't think that solves anything. If we actually have an agreement and it takes a little more time to get the legislation through to make that as smooth as possible, I think that is a very different argument.
It sounds a bit like you're dancing on the head of a pin there, though.
No, I think there's a big difference between if we have an agreement and we need some time to get the legalities done, that's one thing. I think to extend simply because we hadn't reached an agreement would not provide any impetus for that agreement to be reached. And in any case, there's no guarantee the EU would want to do that.
We're not ready for no deal, are we, frankly?
Well, we would be able to deal with that scenario, but it wouldn't be in our interest to go there. It seems to me we've got to guard against two things. One is irrational pessimism that says, everything will be a catastrophe, and irrational optimism which says everything will be absolutely okay. The truth lies between the two. If we left the European Union with no deal, there would be disruption to our trade, a big disruption to European trade as well. It wouldn't be in our best interest to do that. Of course, it's survivable, but we don't want to be putting our economy into a position of unnecessary turmoil.
My question, though, is, if you're saying it's just survivable, but it could have been better than this, couldn't it, if the government had started preparing for no deal at an earlier date? This is where a lot of the issue is from, isn't it? Why weren't you preparing for no deal from day one?
Well, you're sitting here in the Department for International Trade, and our very existence has been about preparing for post-Brexit, and we've always had the view that we might get no deal, so let's try to prepare for that. And across the whole of the private sector, businesses are looking to see whether they can make those appropriate mitigations.
Well, let's talk about the preparation for the department, because if we do leave the EU, then we're going to be losing access to 40 EU trade deals. That's 12% of our trade. How many of those have been rolled over?
Well, first of all, we would not lose access to that trade because a great deal of that trade is done and would continue to be done on world trade terms. Those agreements are worth about 11.1%, but let's not quibble about 0.9%. A number of those are already signed. We've signed the Australia and the New Zealand mutual recognition agreements. We've signed the Chile. How many? We've signed the Chile agreement. We're just about to sign the Swiss agreement. We've signed the Faroe Islands, which is important for fishing this week. And we'll want to bring them through as we go on. We're talking to a number of those countries about how we finalise them, and they will come some very late in the day as we get towards the 29th of March.
Still quite a small number, isn't it?
It's not really, because if you look at those agreements, 5 of those agreements represent 8 out of that 11%.
We hear a lot about the WTO. You're just talking there about the WTO. How worried are you about the fact that this is an organisation that is going through a rocky period, to say the least? I mean, look at the way that the US is blocking or trying to block judges to the WTO. I mean, is this really the right time to be relying on this organisation? Yes, and it's in fact time to help strengthen the WTO and update the WTO. There are a whole range of issues. You mentioned just a couple of them, but there are others. The fact that we have not liberalised services the way we've liberalised goods, the fact that even the differentiation between what is a good and what's a service is blurred, and yet the mechanics around governance are not clear. I said to my Chinese counterpart some time ago, I said, if I had asked you the question in 1995, if I sell you a digital code over the internet to make something on your 3D printer, have I sold you a good or a service? You wouldn't have understood that question in 1995, and yet we're using the same rules to govern the global economy when that global economy itself is fundamentally different. So we do need to update the WTO, and as we take up our independent seat after we leave the EU, that will be one of our great priorities. Do you worry, though, the way that some supporters of Brexit talk about the WTO, like this is the fix-all solution to any issues we might have if we leave the EU without a deal? Well, most of our trade most of world trade operates under WTO terms. But not just on WTO. People have other trade deals to supplement it. That is my point, indeed. If WTO was so good, people wouldn't be looking to have trade agreements or customs unions, which are ways in which you can further improve on those WTO rules. And it's always seemed to me a bit strange that people would say, well, we don't need to worry about having a future trade deal with Europe, we can operate on WTO terms, while at the same time saying we should have a free trade agreement with the United States to get away from WTO rules. So we have to be consistent. Do you think that Theresa May was right or wrong to decide not to call on the services of Crawford Falconer, who is the top trade negotiator at your department, someone that many people are very respectful of when it comes to a post-Brexit trade future for the UK? Well, let me tell you, he's not exactly underemployed at the moment. He's extremely busy here in this department as the chief negotiator. Sounds like a bit of a prepared answer, that. But what do you really think? Come on. He's busy enough. I don't think we should be delving into which bits of the civil service are used for which. It's the government policy that matters. But do you think he would do a good job if Theresa May did decide to use him? Oh, I think he does a great job. But what do I do if he's doing something else? What do you make about the way that Theresa May's handled the negotiations?
Well, the Prime Minister's had a very difficult hand because she's not only been negotiating with the European Union, at times she's been negotiating with her own party. This is a Leave country with a Remain Parliament, and it's a Parliament with no,
and a Remain Prime Minister.
With no majority. The Prime Minister has been very clear, and I think has been very insistent on carrying out the will of the British people in the referendum. I wish more people in our Parliament would do what they were elected to do, which was to fulfil the promise they made to honour that referendum.
Do you think that people who don't may be punished in the ballot box the next election then?
Well, 80% of MPs in this Parliament were elected on a manifesto, either Labour or Conservative, promising to honour the result of the referendum. Those who get elected on that promise and then don't follow it through once they get to Parliament, I think will have a difficult time with the voters the next time, and if that happens, then they deserve it.
The International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, there.